Probably most of you have already heard the Klaus Can, so in the following section we'll have 2 speakers. Go ahead.
I was really pleased the other day to get Julia's email where she sort of said, perhaps anticipating some overlong talks, she said, well, we're really looking for, not looking for, you know, highly polished presentations of finished research. It's more about, you know, provocative ideas and things, and, you know, try and keep it short and sweet. And I thought, oh, perfect, this is great because, well, I'll explain why that was perfect. And fortunately, now that Klaus isn't here, that falls to the ground. Originally, when I agreed to do this, it was on the assumption that I'd be coming out of, or at least would be well into, a period of research, and that in fact I would have some results, some conclusions to give to you, and that in fact I'd be addressing you from a high point. Okay, I would have climbed a mountain and I would be on a high point and I would be telling you what I could see and describing it all in beautiful detail, and of course you'd all be very impressed. And that's not going to happen. That is not going to happen. I am not at a high point. I am at a low point, not morally, but research-wise. And let me show you what I mean. Each of those 5 pieces, each of those 5 strings describes something that I've been working on. And each of those could have been a high point that I had ascended to and could have been telling you all about what I could see in great clarity. In fact, I could have been on a couple of them at once, or I could have been sort of in an intervening ridge like the, you know, the peak at Darien, able to see 2 oceans at once. Instead of which, I'm not on the high point of any of those. In fact, if I had to locate myself, if you were interested in organizing a search, it'd probably be somewhere in there, which is not a peak, it's a valley, a heavily forested valley. Let me just quickly, very briefly explain to you what these 5 things are. Model of transcription, this is an area that I've been interested in ever since Michael and Klaus's paper on trying to organize a formal model of transcription. And I sort of followed along after their paper, rather like a child going for a walk with its parents. They were kind of striding along ahead, interested in getting on, and I was sort of lagging behind and sort of noticing things and saying, Dad, Mom, look at this, it's really interesting. And they were tolerant, as good parents are, but basically saying, you know, come along, we've got places to go. But I'm still interested in that. I still haven't quite, I can't leave that alone, but I've had to put it to one side. So I'm not at anywhere near a height on that. Meaning of text is something that I've been working on for a couple of years. You may have seen a couple of presentations that I've done relevant to that. Model of handwriting comes out of some work I'm doing as part of my job at DDH, working on the DigiPal, or Digital Paleography project, of which Peter Stokes is the principal investigator. Model of the domain of medieval handwritten documents is also related to DigiPal. And the world of Ben Jonson, as mediated through the Cambridge edition, refers to the fact that, as some of you will probably know, Cambridge University Press is about to publish a new complete edition of the works of Ben Jonson, and DDH will be responsible for the digital edition. So I'll show you some sort of slides that relate to each of these 5 things and explain how I got lost. And let me tell you that I didn't get this lost overnight. okay? I took 5 years of hard work to get wherever the hell I am today. This wasn't just an easy thing. So some of you will have seen this before. This is a diagram, a model, if you like, that came out of my work that picked up on what Michael and Klaus had been doing, and it was just adding some stuff that I thought was necessary to it. This is something that I've had to put aside. I'm not finished with it yet, and some of the work on the other things that I've been doing are going to feed back, I hope, interestingly into this, but I just haven't got to doing that yet. But that's where I was with transcription. This is something I should have done last year, actually, at Stanford. And I don't know why I didn't do this, because it would have saved me a lot of explaining, but 2 years ago, at the DH at London, at King's, I was just expressing some disquiet about the fact that we use certain terms in digital humanities and they don't seem to be ever really fully defined or explicated anywhere. And it was just bothering me, and I thought, well, you know, we really should pay attention to the terms we're using and try and figure out exactly what it is that we mean when we use them. And then I thought, well, you know, if you're going to stand up and say that, then it kind of is beholden on you to actually do some work along those lines yourself. So last year at DH, I gave this talk, and this is a diagram of the approach where I decided I was concentrating on the term text, because that seems to me one of the most interestingly problematic of the terms that we use. And so the approach that I decided to use was, well, I'll take a core instance, something that's obviously something, let me rephrase this carefully, something to which the term text obviously applies in humanities because they do so overtly and with great authority, which is the scholarly print edition. And if I take that as a core instance and I say, well, this seems to have certain characteristics that every instance of this core instance has certain characteristics, then there must be a point at which those characteristics no longer apply, so that would then be the boundary of what it is to be something to which the term text can apply. So if I sort of measure that distance, or if I come up with some marginal cases and sort of measure, well, do those characteristics still pertain or not, then we can come up with a boundary. We can say beyond that, this is not text or atext, which was another distinction that I was interested in following. So that was as far as I got with that. And I gave the talk at DH, and then I sort of reshaped and slightly reworked the paper for submission to the journal for the special issue, and I got some good comments back from the reviewers, very useful. So I'm reworking the paper based on the good feedback I got. But one of the comments that I got disturbed me, not because I thought it was wrong, but well, this is a sentence from the paper I gave at DH. This is my conclusion, where I'll let you read it as I'm talking, but essentially what this is saying is that text is a floating signifier, right? I mean, it's just there in the air in digital humanities, and we kind of, when we feel we need it, we grab it and pull it down and slap it onto something. Notice that last sentence there, a good deal of ontological work needs to be done before this can be asserted with confidence. Now, I actually left that sentence out of the version that I submitted to the journal. But the comment that disturbed me, and it was a perfectly reasonable one, was that the reviewer said, well, you know, I really like the way the argument kind of builds up, and there's lots of interesting examples, but then he comes to this conclusion, and it's kind of a letdown, it's kind of lame. And what disturbed me about that was that I actually thought that was the most exciting conclusion that came out of this, was the fact that that it's really hard to actually pin down a meaning for a text, the fact that it is this floating signifier. I mean, to me that seemed like a really, really knotty thing to deal with. But I could see that from another point of view, that was actually perhaps of no interest to people at all, that it was just so obvious that how could this possibly be an interesting conclusion, which I thought was fair enough. But what I found particularly interesting about that was a kind of a tension between what I, for want of a better phrase, I'm going to call a taxonomic imperative, right? Where we tend to want to drive down through a taxonomy to reach a terminal leaf, right? Whereby we can say, I have distinguished this thing from other things that may be related to it, but I have got to this point where I can finally say, and I get down here and it goes no further. This is it. So there's that, right? And you can see that driving down from some sort of grandparent node all the way down to a final terminal leaf. Here I am, I've arrived. And we sort of like to slap labels on our terminal leaves. But the problem with something like text is that it spans across multiple terminal leaves. And the tension there between that taxonomic imperative to drive down and find something, distinguish it and label it, and the sort of the tendency of natural language to spread itself, to smear itself across, is something that I thought was really interesting, and it made me realize that more work was needed. So coming out of that work then on the sort of what the meaning of the term text and the way we use it, two paths looked kind of interesting to me. One was the ontological path, which is to, instead of just saying, well, okay, we've got this core, the scholarly print edition, and these rather vaguely delineated characteristics, I thought what I should do really is I should try to formally specify what is a core instance. What are the characteristics? So that pushes me towards ontology. And then the other thing is to come up with some way of dealing with this, the relation between the drive to systematize and that taxonomic imperative and the problem of the fuzziness of natural language. So that was another thing. But sometimes you have to put these aside because you have a day job. And part of the day job involves the digital edition of the Cambridge new edition of the works of Ben Jonson. Now, the Cambridge edition is vast. It's been in production now for well over a decade. And the digital edition is not exactly, it's not exactly an afterthought, it's not an add-on, but the digital edition is basically the print edition made digital plus other stuff that they simply couldn't fit into the print edition because it would have been too monumental. So there's a limited amount of time and money that can be spent on the digital edition. So basically what we're doing is, to put it bluntly, data modeling on the cheap. Okay? We do need some entities. We're going to try and discover some entities in the text through computational means. We're going to try and find people and places just through automated processing. But when you're talking about an author like Jonson, when you're talking about a comprehensive edition, you're going to have lots of strings that refer to different kinds of thing with the same string. For example, the string Volpone can refer to many different kinds of thing, right? It can refer to, and some of these terms you'll recognize, or they'll be very similar to terms you know from, say, FRBR. So it can be a work, or it can be a version of a work, or it can be a realization of a version. So I wanted to come up with ways to distinguish the kinds of things that might be being referred to by particular strings. So we decided that we would use EATS, which is the Entity Authority Transaction Service. EATS is not a data modeling tool. EATS is really all about a place to store information, to store disambiguating information about entities. But you can twist and pervert it into a poor man's data modeling tool, if you like, because you can declare your entities, you can declare what types of entities you have, and you can declare relations between those entities. So I thought, well, I'm just going to, as an early attempt at doing this, I'm just going to look at the data and come up with the entities that I want, and then specify some relations, and then maybe later on I'll either translate them to an existing schema or keep them as they are and just say this is also the same as something from FRBR or FRBR or C. whatever. So here are some early diagrams sort of mapping out entities and relationships, and you can see there we've got Ben Jonson as a person, and we've got Every Man Out of His Humor as a work, and then we've got a quarto edition as a version, and so on. All very standard kind of entity relationship mapping. And there's another one, similar kind of thing. You can see we've got an event entity. And here's one of the early EATS records that I created just as part of testing this process. And we've got an entity type event. Johnson marries Anne Lewis. Okay, fair enough. And then we've got another event entity. Johnson kills Gabriel Spencer in a duel. And then I thought, well, I wanted to start mapping this on the diagram too. And I started here. Here I started having to think. And that's always a bad sign, because the more you start thinking about this stuff, the more difficult it gets. So here, for example, this goes back to something that Andrew was saying in the panel discussion. I was really interested in the relation, not just the entity, the person entity. I mean, they're fairly standard, but I'm interested in what kind of relations do we need in this? So, and what is the relation between a person and an event? So here, for example, I've come up with a person has experience of an event. But I've also got a personal relationship between Ben Jonson and this actor, Gabriel Spencer. Ben Jonson and Gabriel Spencer had a duel, and Gabriel Spencer died. Okay? So in the same way that you have, say, person marries person, I've got Ben Jonson kills Gabriel Spencer. It just seemed, though, the more I thought about it, that just seemed like a weird relation between two people. So then I thought, well, maybe this is better. Okay, we'll lose that personal relationship. We'll take that out, and we'll just have the relationship, the fact that Ben Jonson killed Gabriel Spencer now just becomes mediated through the event by the fact that they both have experience in the event. Which is plausible, but the problem is that the more I thought about this, the more I thought about, well, there seems to be two events there in a sense, or where do you draw the line at an event? I mean, is it that they have a duel as one event, and Gabriel Spencer gets wounded as another event, and then he dies as another event? What is an event? And as soon as you start asking that question, what is X, you're doomed, because now the gravitational pull of ontology starts sucking you in, because you think, well, there must be smart people who figured out what an event is. So then you start going to the ontology books, and yes, everybody discusses an event, but they're all subtly different. So then you go further back, trying to find out, well, what is an event? Sounds like a natural category, right? What are natural categories? And then it turns out that, well, yes, they all have similar natural categories, but they're not all the same, and they don't organize them. They don't all organize them the same either. So I got stuck in this question about, does it make sense? What is the relationship between two people? Should a relation just be something that is like a long-term relation? Does an immediate happening, like somebody sticks a sword in somebody else and kills them, is that a relationship between two people? I mean, but if it's not, then what's the difference between marrying somebody or killing them? I won't go any further down that line. Anyway, the moral of the story is, and again, these are all reasons for why I'm lost, right? These are all reasons why I start down or start up a height, intending it to be a pleasant hike that will take me to somewhere where I can give you the benefit of my wisdom, and I end up lost. And this is why. It's hard to do just a little data modeling. Even though you start off with the best intentions, it's really hard to stop at any point. Obviously, don't reinvent the wheel is a good principle, right? I mean, people have spent hundreds of years writing ontologies and modeling entities and entity classes, so don't reinvent the wheel, but don't assume either that there's somewhere back down the line there's a standard wheel that everybody agrees on. And simple entities, it turns out, are never that simple. Complicating things even further is Digipal. Digipal is a fascinating project. The idea is to come up with an extensive database of instances of medieval scholarly handwriting, particularly databases of letter forms, so that the idea that Peter has is that he wants to give some kind of objectivity to the way that features of handwriting are described. Because medieval scholars all they all know what they're talking about, but they all talk in slightly different terms, and they all use slightly different descriptors, and the idea is to try and get some kind of uniformity in description of letter forms. So as part of that, Peter wanted to concentrate on modeling handwriting, what the components of handwriting, what goes on in handwriting. And one of the things that I was tasked with doing was thinking about how that fits into a wider world of documents, writing, texts, books, etc. So being a bit of an idiot, I decided to create an ontological framework for that would slot Peter's model when he had finalized it, that would be able to slot into a model of everything to do with the things that we study. And you can see sort of the general outline of the thing being formed here, and it just got more and more complicated. As I tried to define what things were, I just kept having to add more and more classes and categories, and I thought, this can't be right. So eventually, time ran out, and I had to give up on that because it just was just unfolding like a kind of Mandelbrot curve. It was ridiculous. So this is the current model. We actually are going with sticking with a relational database. This is the UML model. It's pretty much final. I can't say I'm completely happy with it, but in the end, work had to get done. So this is the one we've got. Now, the really interesting part about this is the part that Peter's been working on, which is if that vertical column of blue squares, starting with ontograph up at the top, and going down to graph. And what that is, basically, is that's the descent from the most abstract conceptual division at a level with no form. In other words, the division between, say, an A and a B, but without giving either of them any form, right down to having something actually written on a piece of parchment. That's what that is. What's really interesting about that model is that I think it's going to have a great deal to do with the model of transcription. But I just haven't quite figured out how to plug it in yet, but I think it's going to be really important to me. And the next step is to try and somehow work all these things together and figure out somewhere how to bring in the ghost at the party, which is text, because everywhere you go, it's there, but it's never graspable. It's never really there. I mean, I wish I'd been counting the number of times people have used texts in the discussion this morning. I mean, it's just part of our vocabulary. But it isn't. What kind of thing is it? I mean, for example, when I was trying to work out the basic entities for the Johnson edition, obviously you've got fine distinctions there between various stages of the publication and writing process. And the original FRBR Class 1 entity type simply is just inadequate to deal with that. So that drove me to FRBR, which is the object-oriented version of FRBR, and Alan is on the advisory council or drafting committee or something. And FRBR is a terrific piece of work because it actually addresses a great deal of the deficiencies of FRBR Class 1 entity types. But the text isn't there in FRBR. It's just not as an entity. But if you read the spec, which describes the classes that are in FRBR, text is used many times, as if we just all know what it means. And in a sense, of course, we do just all know what it means, because when people used it this morning, no one stuck their hand up and said, well, what the hell do you mean by that? What are you talking about? But I'm really interested in this phantasmal thing that permeates our discourse but doesn't seem to be something we can really easily pin down. And let me be I'm delighted to be the first person this morning to comment on the wonderful carpet we have, which, as I would say, contains text. I don't think it contains a text, although you could make a text out of this carpet. And I would love to see Michael and use his model to how would we transcribe this carpet? I think it probably could be done, but you know, is it going across the walls? Is it going up and down? It's an interesting question. So this is where I am. You can see I'm completely lost, but I'm floundering around. But I think there are ways to go. I've decided that there are things that will help me, although they're not easy because it's a question of stepping out of your own comfort zone into other people's disciplines, which of course is A, resented by them, and B, is an awful lot of work on your part. So I'm open to collaborative work here. So here's where I think I can get out. I'm splitting myself into three people. One person is going out through scientific ontology. I've delved briefly into fundamental ontology, and it's a scary place that deals with propositional logic and not much else. And it's like some weird Doctor Who episode where, you know, there's just a white screen and a person and nothing else. And they ask questions like, well, why is there something rather than nothing? And I just want to know what an event is. So that's too scary for me. I'm not going there. But the scientific ontology, I think, will help. The other way out is through set theory, I think. And Wendell will know Wendell, I'm sure the answer lies in set theory. And he emailed me back the equivalent of a pat on the head and said, you're probably right. Go ahead. But I think using set theory in conjunction with those levels that you saw in the diagram, the levels between ontograph and graph, is going to be interesting and may also help account may also help drag my account of transcription back into line with Michael's and Klaus's, where they've moved on to trying to deal with the level of an organization rather than a simple stream of tokens. And the other way out, I think, is through Wittgenstein and people like him, which is the philosophy of language, because I don't see how else to try and deal with this business of the tension between the floating signifiers that just wants to spread itself over everything. And of course, we're very happy to let it do that because it's convenient for us. And that drive to distinguish something and say what it is, to pin it down, say, I've isolated you now. And that's it. Thank you very much.
We thought it's a good moment to have some questions now and after the second talk, and then we can have a general discussion. So, Chris.
Two observations. I don't know whether they're really questions. No, one is a question, please. What about ideal types? Why don't you try and describe, not in terms of 3 or 5 or 6 characteristics of something, and distinguish between, make a clear-cut distinction between what's at the core, what's beyond the outer perimeter of your definition. We know that in an ideal type definition of any phenomenon, it's always a mix of n parameters, and some may be required, others may be contingent. So that's the one question. And the second, as for events, I don't know whether I should say it, but I will say it. I know somebody who wrote a book on events. It happens to be me. And I came to the conclusion that it is completely nonsensical to think of events as something that exists. An event is something that you describe as an event, or define as an event. So the matter is really as to what your definition is going to be. And in certain domains there are valid descriptions and definitions of what an event is, and in others the need hasn't arisen. So an event, to look out for events in the world doesn't make sense to me.
I'm very happy to hear that.
So
I mean,
you were exactly right to have trouble.
I'm sorry?
So you were right to have trouble.
Well, I think I was right to have trouble, but that doesn't get rid of the need to deal somehow with changes of states of affairs, right?
Well, that's one description under which an event can occur, and it happens to be the one that I favor myself. And that's a truly Wittgensteinian approach which you would then be taking. But I think it's wasted energy to look into events as real life phenomena.
Yeah, I'm so glad you gave this talk. It's just really.
Sorry, Steve.
I'm so glad you gave this talk, which was thrilling from beginning to end. I think questions like, what is an event, and what is a text, and I would go further, what is a tree, what is a game, I think what is a duel? I think these questions are philosophically nonsensical. And I noticed that your trouble is your trouble is not your inability to write systems. Because if you're, in terms of writing a system, you try to write a system in which people can locate duels, and you can do that successfully. Your trouble arises because you think that there should be some kind of relationship between that highly functional purpose and the fabric of the universe. You think that there should be some correspondence between that act of making something that sort of works in the world and reality, and ontological reality. And when you point to Wittgenstein, when we go through these 3 clouds, we get to Wittgenstein, I could hear the sigh in your voice as if we'd be jumping off the cliff if we just had jettisoned this entire ontological project and said, look, text is the sum of the instance in which that word is used in the language, end of story. Now we'll get back to writing the system, that can do something for people in the world. And so I feel like, I'm listening to this and I'm wondering, is your problem a real problem? Because to me it sounds like it's not it's a psychosis. It's not. And I say that of course not to insult you, but I mean it's like you're getting trapped in a kind of philosophical conundrum, and all I can think is why not decide to stop having that conundrum? Because solving the conundrum, what you would have to convince me is that solving the conundrum would make for better functional, better programs in the world. I'm absolutely not convinced about it.
Oh, I agree. And there has to be a point in the practical real world where you just say, okay, that's it. I'm going to go with...
What other point could there be? What other point is there?
Well, call it psychosis, or call it what Wendell said about himself earlier, an obsession. I can't leave it alone. I can't leave it alone. I'm actually fascinated by the fact that we use text a lot and we can't define it. Or we can define it in 20 different ways and they all serve the purpose. I'm sorry, but that fascinates me. There comes a point where I have to divorce my pursuit of that from needing to get projects finished on time. But I also can't resist the temptation to be the man who finally joins them and achieve lasting fame.
I think there is something coming out of this heterogeneity of attention we have, because we all are interested in small parts, and then the problem is like one could be interested in duals, and there's so much other things in these texts one remotely thinks of like being an event, right? And then once we start to describe a whole variety of these things, then we run into this problem that we end up with this, at 3 o'clock at night we dream about like describing the universe, right? But I think there's, on the other hand, there's another functional thing. But if you, for example, Freebase has a very interesting, freebase.com has a very interesting kind of different way how to describe what often is called event. They call it compound value type, which is basically an empty node, and it brings together, say, a person, time range, a war, and the killing of another person, whatever, right? Or a birth location of a person or something like that. But the node is empty, and that's the interesting thing. I think the invention of these compound value types in ontology is a little bit like the invention of zero in mathematics, because we can do much better things, much more with these zero nodes, which don't have a name, a label, or anything except for an ID, so you can address it.
So it's not a thing in itself, it's a thing that comes into existence when other things are in a particular conjunction.
Yeah. And to have that, if you call it event or not, is something really good.
I should say that the dual was just one of those little, it was just the snag that stopped my smooth gliding into an easy definition of some things, finish the task, and get on with my life. It was just that one little thing that kind of hooked the sweater, and then the entire sweater began to unravel. Well, Wendell remarked earlier, you know, what's interesting is when the model fails, or when the model that you thought was going to be simple starts getting more and more complicated in a recursively nasty way.
I'd just like to suggest another area you may want to look at.
Oh God, I've only got one life to live.
But it's completely pragmatic. It's nothing to do with ontology. It's not very complicated. And that's data mining. So instead of trying to construct an ontology, you just have a set of features, attribute value pairs. It's just a list of features. So, and you characterize a text in your collection by these features, or by these attributes with particular values. And then on the basis of these attribute value pairs, you just calculate, you know, how typical, you know, the text is given. Okay, your ideal text has all these properties. That's how the text is defined, yeah? No matter, you know, how these categories are ontologically related, it's just a list. And then you just test a text for, you know, how typical it is, given that this is your typical text. And you can apply all kinds of methods from data mining, like automatic classification or clustering, and just see what happens. And it can be very instructive just to do that. So that's about your text classification.
What kind of data are you talking about mining here? What kind of data are you talking about mining?
Oh, well, that would be the features, the attributes, the properties you assign to the text.
And I think the problem is what kind of data do you look at to find those things?
Well, your text.
Textual
Right. If it was a simple linguistic thing, that would be easy, but I'm not quite sure how to, I mean, I see what you're saying, I'm just not quite sure how to apply it, because the sorts of characteristics I'm looking at are not amenable to that kind of analysis.
The way you build your categories, would it be easy to take a step back and say, okay, the tree, the hierarchy you showed us, this is just one way to build class. I mean, the very old-fashioned, good traditional way, but you can say, I'm using a prototype approach instead of building classes by specific features, and then you would have a totally different outcome, actually, describing what a text is. And many of the problems you were talking about, like the smearing of the features, they are actually artifacts by the approach you take, how to build your ontology. So I kind of think it's really the way the mental tools you use here, and they create the problems you're then baffled by in a way. At least in the event case and in the text case probably too, as far as I know the text discussion. So,
I'd like to thank you for
please louder.
Sorry. I'd like to thank you as well for this talk and for the event bit, and I'd like to take up your remark once again about the anti-value node. In RDF, we have a similar concept, which is that of a blank node. And that is something that has no differential correspondent entity in so-called reality. And actually, the interesting part of that is that it comes into existence via modeling. So the blank node is there first, and data are bounded later. So you do not model data that way. You create a conceptual entity, and then try to see what it relates to in the world. So it's not about data modeling, it's about conceptual modeling, and later eventually binding that to real data entities in the world. So I think if you introduce the new quality, it's later.
Can we start to ask we have some question after this session, but then we can swap that to the next speaker.
I just want to make a comment on these two things. So I think data mining is one way how you can extract clusters, but the clusters often are highly overlapping. So you have exactly the same problem as if you start to think about
This one on data model?
So it's not like data mining will be better than modeling the first step if you have a lot of
Okay.
Overlap is another way where this approach to building
Yes.
a class,
Yes.
saying I need classes
Gonna show on
that
here.
don't have overlap, which is probably not the way we construct our
Okay.
world. And we are talking basically about construction, world constructions, not about the things in themselves. There are no events from here, and texts are not out there. We are creating them.
Right.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks again for your talk.
So I just noticed I have some leftover animations in the slide set. I've actually never put it in slide mode before, so so you may see me moving through them very fast. Something quick, so I don't forget. In fact, I'm tempted just to respond to the questions and continue to interrogate Paul, but I don't think I'll remember to say this. The issue of blank nodes in RDF is sort of interesting. They aren't necessarily as unconnected with plausible ontological entities as one might think. That if you think of them as concrete events, then they correspond to an approach to events that's been used to accommodate adverbial modification of predication. Davidsonian events. So this does not necessarily apply to all blank nodes. In particular, I think some EDM blank nodes don't have natural ontological entities. They suggest NTS suspecta, actually. So anyway, I think there are two kinds of blank nodes. Okay, let's see, in Paul's vein of candid honesty and openness about the setting for his talk, I think most of us often, when we look forward to a talk in 6 or 8 months, we imagine we might have that manifesto prepared. You know, we might actually be able to lay out the entire view. At least I think that sometimes, and so I come up and I submit a title and an abstract for that manifesto. Talk rolls around. I don't have a manifesto. I have a grand title and a very promising abstract, but a modest results. Fortunately, this time I was so late that I smartly chose a title that would do for something less grand. Even though taking modeling seriously could look like it's going to be a serious presentation of an approach to modeling, it's really as much about how we look at anybody's conceptual modeling as it is how we do modeling. And I'll admit that I am fairly, if I say this sort of ironically or self-deprecating way, maybe I'll say that I am a serious modeler. I believe that I'm interested in modeling that attempts to provide an account, a theory, not just a guide to developing a system. And I go about, when I get a chance to go about that, I look kind of literal-minded and naive, I suspect. I feel like I've been talked about in the last few minutes of the discussion here. But I'm also just trying to have fun, to tell you the truth. And this is how I have fun. Like Paul, you know, you're not going to change me. I can't be deprogrammed, you know, so keep to yourselves. Thomas Zaz has some interesting thing to say about people who don't like the fact that other people aren't like them, and they want to change them to be like them. As I said in my abstract, this is not to everyone's taste. Fortunately, what's not to everyone's taste, I'm not going to be doing so much of just now, if I can help it. So, serious modeling versus taking modeling seriously, I think that's what I was just talking about. I'm going to take up I think I'll get through 4 specific little discussions. One of inheritance in FRBR, one on identity and change and the change in the planet's data model, one on a radio obliqua and the European data model, and types and roles in FRBR. And then I'll try to say something about what is distinctive about humanities data modeling. And I know some of you have seen these before, but I'll try to make them hang together in a more interesting way. Most of you are probably familiar with FRBR, and Paul assumed that you all are, but I'm not going to assume that you all are. I'm going to quickly rehearse the functional requirements for bibliographic records. It's a conceptual model. They use that phrase, and that always perks my ears up. Specifically, it's an entity relationship model of works, texts, editions, authors, subjects, etc. And it is created primarily to help design systems for managing bibliographic records. That is, the developers of FRBR did not see themselves as performing first-order science and delivering a theory of bibliographic things. That doesn't stop me from looking at it that way, and that's what I mean by taking modeling seriously, taking other people's modeling seriously, because it's fun. It's very influential, as I'm sure some of you know. bibliographic databases are being FRBRized, software systems also being FRBRized. The new edition of the Anglo-American Cataloging Rules, RDA, describes FRBR as its foundation, and it's increasingly being applied in the sciences now to, as an approach to understanding and managing scientific data. Most of you are familiar with the Group 1 entity types: work, expression, manifestation, and item. Work is a distinct intellectual or artistic creation. Expression, the intellectual or artistic realization of a work in the form of alphanumeric, musical, choreographic notation, etc. Manifestation, the physical embodiment of an expression of a work. And item, a single exemplar of a manifestation. So the nice colloquial terms, if you take a book-like view of these things, is work, text, edition, and copy. Notice that nice interlocking cascade of definitions. An expression realizes a work, a manifestation embodies an expression, an item exemplifies a manifestation. There's the picture, that's the ER diagram. One-to-many relationship between work and expression, manifestation, item, many-to-many between expression and manifestation. Do you know why? Anthologies. So, in FRBR, each entity type has a distinctive set of attributes. Works, for instance, have attributes like subject or genre. Expressions have attributes like language. Manifestations have attributes like typeface. Items have attributes like condition or location. These are disjoint sets of attributes. Disjoint sets of attributes. So a work may have a subject, but it does not have a language, typeface, or condition. That probably seems intuitive. An expression may have a language, I think it will have a language, but it does not have a subject. The work it realizes has a subject. The expression doesn't have a subject. And of course, expressions don't have typeface or condition. A manifestation, edition, might have a typeface, but it does not have a subject or a language. The expression it embodies has a language. The expression it embodies has a language, and the work which is realized by the expression it embodies has a subject. And similarly for item. Items can have conditions and locations, but they don't have subject, language, or typeface attributes. Work, expression, manifestation, these seem to be abstract things. We don't actually find them located in space and time. They don't seem to enter into causal relationships. Items, however, do seem to exist in space and time as material things. So, ontologically, you might say that FRBR is an eliminativist approach to the book. Our ordinary book might, I think, be plausibly said to be about painting in Florence and Siena, in French, typesetted neo-Bauhaus, and mustard-stained. A book might have those characteristics, but in fact, there's no entity in FRBR that has those characteristics. So, I'm fond of FRBR. I've talked about it on a number of occasions before. I'm fond of it because it's an opportunity for me to think in what feels to me like interesting ways about interesting things. And I find that I'm less and less inclined to defend any particular point of view, and I really am more and more inclined to keep myself intellectually engaged. And regardless of exactly what ontology one might want to accept, or if there's an alternative to accepting ontologies, I think it's interesting to take a close look at somebody's effort to identify the entities and relationships that are important to them as practitioners in a particular domain, because that's what we're looking at here. The FRBR committee was a committee primarily of catalogers. So an interesting thing about FRBR is it's often said to exhibit inheritance. So for instance, I'm not going to read all of these, but just a couple. The FRBR model implies information at the highest level is inherited by bibliographic entities at lower levels of the hierarchy. Characteristics of the work belong to all expressions, all manifestations, and all items. Attributes are inherited by all lower levels of the hierarchy, and so on. These are all well-known, really smart people in the bibliographic community. The last one, Barbara Tillett, is actually the lead in the FRBR, in the development of FRBR. There's something weird about this, though. Where's the inheritance? The attributes are in the documentation are explicitly disjoint sets. In fact, the whole idea behind this kind of strategy is to segregate attributes according to entity and not apply them democratically across all the entities, even though that's how we often talk. There's certainly nothing about this diagram that suggests inheritance. Is there? There are rectangles, it's true, and there are arrows. And it seems uncharitable to suggest that these really smart people looked at this diagram and couldn't recognize it as an ER diagram, but instead saw it as some sort of taxonomic class diagram, which it isn't. It is uncharitable, and I wouldn't put it that way, but it's still kind of curious. There's nothing in the FRBR documentation that suggests inheritance, and there's nothing in this diagram that suggests inheritance. Inheritance, general inheritance of attributes, is inconsistent with the entire strategy that's being deployed here. There's no inheritance in FRBR, despite what the authors of FRBR say. They actually don't really, I can't resist putting it this way, they don't really understand the model that they created. I think that's actually a counterexample to other things I believe, that this is even possible. But it's as if they don't understand the model they created. So when I say inheritance, I mean what might be called classical subsumptive inheritance, based upon the set-subset relationship. There are other kinds of inheritance that might be plausibly applied here, diffeasible inheritance, propagation, but there's no classical inheritance. And it's easy to see that FRBR itself describes works as abstract and items as concrete. Brace yourself, this seems like a parlor trick, I know. FRBR describes works as abstract, items as concrete. If there is general subsumptive inheritance down the so-called FRBR hierarchy, then FRBR items are also abstract and concrete. But that's ridiculous, right? So here's an alternative way of looking at bibliographic entities. This is another conceptual model. This is from the third chapter called Bibliographic Entities, of a great book by Elaine Savanonius called The Intellectual Foundations of Information Organization. So we start with individual concrete documents, concrete material things, not abstract things. Some of those documents, we might say, are narratively similar. Let's call W1 a set. Let W1 stand for a set of narratively similar documents. Some of those narratively similar documents in W1 might be textually similar. So we can partition W1 into sets of textually similar documents. W1E1 is one set of textually similar documents. W1E2 is another set of textually similar documents. W1E3 another set. I just prefixed the name of these textually similar sets with the with W1 to show that they're subsets of W1. So the idea here is that narratively similar documents are physical documents that carry the same story, have the same work. But we want to avoid having to give an account of works. We want to take a more material, nominalist approach to our world. So instead, we stick with individual, concrete, physical documents and notice that some of them are similar in a particular way, and that lets us form sets of similar documents. So textually similar documents can be similarly grouped into groups according to whether or not they are, in some sense, you have to use a little bit of charity here to make this work, materially similar. So in this way, you can kind of accomplish the same sort of modeling objectives. At least it looks like you might be able to accomplish the same sort of modeling objectives that you could accomplish with FRBR. We can talk, we have the notion of work, only it's not a work, it's rather a set of physical documents that tell the same story. Within a set of similar documents that tell the same story, we have various translations or textual variants, and those are grouped into sets. Within one of those sets, we have another partition according to material similarity. Here, you have inheritance, because this is a class hierarchy. And any property that applies to everything in a work set will apply to all of its subsets and their subsets and their subsets. So something like this is going on. So this is an example, I'm tempted to say, of me having fun. I'm taking a deflationary approach to this to try to avoid Stephen's arrows. This is me having fun by looking seriously at other people's modeling. And seriously and appreciatively, not just because I wouldn't have anything to do if somebody didn't do some models and make little infelicitous errors, but because, in fact, I find these models stimulating and illuminating. I find that they improve my understanding, although often in ways I can't quite articulate. So there's one example of taking modeling, ordinary conceptual modeling, seriously, at least having fun, or at least me having fun. That's a personal thing, I suppose. Everybody has their own taste in these things. And perhaps also getting some better understanding of what our options are for looking at the world. Here's another example. Whenever I see a box and an arrow, you know, I sit right up and look closely. This is from a very widely a well-known, influential conceptual model for preservation planets. And there's a piece of the conceptual model, this is a UML diagram, where the class of digital files is represented with a UML arrow indicating subclass of byte streams. So on this account, a digital file is a byte stream. In the list of attributes for digital files, we see last modification date. And I know this is sometimes a little irritating meditation of mine, but I look at this and say, really? File is a byte stream and it has a modification date. So a particular file could have been modified. Now, we all talk that way, and maybe that needs to be represented. But if a file is a byte stream, or a byte stream is just a particular sequence of bytes, how can it be modified? What's the it that gets modified? I can understand turning my attention from one sequence of bytes to another, but what is it that once was one sequence of bytes and now is another sequence of bytes? If we represent that in knowledge representation languages like RDF and OWL, in order to bring this into the world of linked data and the semantic web, we will have paradoxes. They are inevitable. So if there's a possible practical reason for facing some of these amusing little puzzles and paradoxes, I'd say that's it. As time goes by, we try more and more to be as formal as we possibly can and do as much lights out inferencing and processing as possible. We do that through logic-based languages like RDF. We're going to have puzzles. And they're going to be traditional puzzles, familiar puzzles. And they're ones that we can avoid with human intervention, but they're harder to avoid if no humans are around to help. Europeana data model. We're going to hear more about that, right? I love it. I love all these models. I know every time I talk about problems with models, people think, oh, you don't like such and such. I love them all. And I don't mean it, I didn't mean that like it sounds. I actually, I am very looking forward to working with Europeana data model people on a number of projects. But there is a number of interesting, to me, little puzzles in the EDM. I'll mention just one. So we often make assertions about things in the world. We say that a particular thing has a particular value for a particular attribute. Sometimes we want to say that somebody else made an assertion about a thing. We want to, that is, say that Sid, for instance, claimed that, and something that Sid is fond of claiming. But we want to hold it at arm's length. We don't want to assert it ourselves. We just report that that's what Sid said. Obviously, in the humanities data modeling, things like this are very important because we're looking at historical data, for instance. What did people say? What did they believe? What did they doubt? There are, these are typically grammatically complex sentences with a main verb and a subordinate clause. They don't break up into compounds of simple truth functional connectives. So how do we do that? And one problem with RDF is that if we simply add as triples somebody's assertion to our collection, we end up asserting it. We don't want to, I'm not backing Sid up on his crazy ideas. I just want to report that he has them. I want to report what Sid claims about the Mona Lisa. I want to add that assertion, the assertion that Sid claims the Mona Lisa is the best painting ever, whatever. I want to add that secondary assertion to my collection of triples, because I do believe that. I have discovered something about what Sid believes, but I haven't discovered much about the Mona Lisa. So this is a very, I think, common need in humanities data management to represent that a particular assertion was made without accidentally committing yourself to the assertion itself. It's not easy to do in RDF. It's not easy to do, period. We've been puzzling over this for 100 years, at least. But one approach to the problem, which certainly in a sense works, is to define a proxy for the thing you're talking about and make the assertion vis-a-vis that proxy, that that thing. And so now I can collect all the things that Sid has said about the Mona Lisa, and I can have Sid saying it about a proxy for the Mona Lisa, and I represent that proxy as a proxy for the Mona Lisa, but I'm not backing Sid up on his claims about the Mona Lisa. And the proxy node that you can see in the middle here is an example of this. You notice that it's connected to the Mona Lisa by the ORE proxy 4 relationship. And the claim that a particular person, namely Leonardo, created the Mona Lisa as made by, in my story, Sid, is indirectly represented here by drawing the DC terms creator arrow from the proxy to Leonardo. This works, in a sense, just fine. Any Perl programmer can manage data that's organized this way. It's very simple. It's very, as far as I know, it's computationally manageable as well. But it's weird because it makes it look like Leonardo created a proxy. And DC terms creator is used in a straightforward way elsewhere in the linked open data world and elsewhere in the bibliographic world in general. It's probably used in a straightforward way in EDM data. So it's not like there's a special sense of DC terms creator. It's rather that there's a particular usage of it, which is somewhat of an idiom. I think that's pretty interesting. I'll also say, but I won't talk about the fact that the medium, see the medium arrow there, for the Mona Lisa is a SCOS concept wood. I'm not sure that that works either. My understanding of SCOS will have the Mona Lisa, if this is true, made out of the concept of wood and not wood. So my last example, I think, yeah. And I will say, so Paul, I don't know if anyone else has ever said that there's no text in FRBR 00, but I really struggled with this, and I told Martin and others that I thought, we have a concept of text. You don't. There's something wrong with this. And I found it very hard, personally, my biggest problem with FRBR 00 is that text is really gone from it. You just adapt to a different picture of the world. And it's a picture where apparently we can say all the things we want to say. I'm not sure, but that's the idea. But text isn't there. So refactoring FRBR. Paul mentioned the difference between types and roles as outlined by Guarino and Welty in their famous 2001 paper. But even before Guarino and Welty were cleansing ontologies with that distinction, relational database theorists and conceptual modelers were puzzling over when you should use a relationship and when you should use an entity type rectangle, when you should use a relationship arrow or triangle, and when you should use an entity type rectangle. If we look at FRBR right here. And I actually don't have a clock, so if I go in late, you need to tell me, yep. We might wonder whether or not some of these rectangles are really nominalized roles that would be better represented as relationships rather than kinds of entities. So for instance, I'm going to gloss the notion of type and role since Paul didn't. He assumed we all knew. So the distinction, and it is a kind of, it's one that grows, that's connected to the traditional data modeling distinction of entity, type, and relationship, but it's somewhat more ontology oriented. So from Guarino and Welty's perspective, there are things in the world like persons, and those persons in particular circumstances enter into roles, particular social circumstances, contingent social circumstances enter into roles. And the types of things that there are can be identified, according to Guarino and Welty, by noticing that to use the example of a person cannot cease to be a person, nor could a person have been without ceasing to be, nor could a person have been anything other than a person. So a person is not something else in some other possible world. Students, on the other hand, can cease to be students very easily, and they frequently do cease to be students. And persons who are students in this possible world might, in other possible worlds, have never been students. So using that test and some other similar ones, we can distinguish kinds of things from the roles that the kinds of things enter into. And if we restrict our rectangles to things that are kinds of things, then expression in particular, we'll start there, and there probably, looks like it might be more of a role than a kind of thing. That is, meaningful text is meaningful text in virtue of the contingent social context in which those symbols exist. So we might say that an expression is a symbol structure in a particular social context in virtue of which it has the meaning that it has. So if we take that approach, we can replace not only expression, but it's a longer argument, but manifestation as well with the notion of symbol structure as a kind of thing, and argue that symbol structures do what they do in the case of expressions, realize works, only in virtue of social context, convention, intentionality, human epistemic agency. It's not in nature, it's in us, and it takes a village. If so, we now have symbol structures here, and the roles remain the same. A symbol structure is a text if it realizes a story. A symbol structure is an addition if it embodies a symbol structure that realizes a story. Well, oops. Generally in ER diagrams, we don't use two rectangles for the same set. So we collapse these rectangles into one symbol structure. This is the refactored FRBR that we've come up with at the University of Illinois at Gislis, that we're using in an NSF project to characterize how scientific data sets do what they do, because it turns out that data in the scientific sense is just as elusive a thing as it is for us. And in general, we found that most of the nouns that we're used to using end up not having anything to refer to by the time we're done with our analysis. So fewer and fewer things, more and more roles. I can talk more about this some other time. So this is the last slide. I thought I'd answer try my hand at answering the question, what is distinctive about humanities data modeling? And I think it's intentionality. It's the fact that we're involved, people. When we're modeling cultural data or humanities data, we're modeling entities and relationships that exist only in virtue of intentionality-laden social activity. The things we're modeling, I'm tempted to say, would not exist if we weren't in the picture. They exist only because of social action, social, intentional, cultural action. The method, I like using the word hermeneutic whenever I can, which is rarely. I'm going to say our method is hermeneutic analysis carried out by agents capable of creating the sorts of things they're studying. The reason we can do this work is because we're the kind of thing that can create these relationships. That's what makes doing this work possible for us. We know about these relationships from the inside. And the challenge is how do we adapt modeling methods, most of which are based upon standard first-order logic. I know many of them here are based on grammars, but conceptual modeling in general is based on first-order logic, and first-order logic is notoriously impotent at representing intentionality, and that's our problem. And that's it.
Paul?
Wow. Okay, go.
I'm just interested why you used story.
Sorry. Great.
Yeah, I have a question regarding the byte stream digital file object modification. You said that
I left that up too long.
well, I have a question because first is the intentionality part. For me as a programmer who has seen such object-oriented models, it's completely logical to think of a digital file byte stream because I can handle it as a byte stream. So me as a programmer, I can have the intention to use it basically as a byte stream, therefore it makes sense to inherit that kind of play from the byte stream. Whereas obviously it doesn't make much sense to modify it. So, could it just be that the dynamic nature of the methods, the attributes are left out?
Yeah. So let me say more generally that I think that, right, so the question is about the example from the planet's preservation data model where the UML showed files as a subset of byte stream. And I said there's something problematic about this because a byte stream cannot lose or gain a byte, and yet these files have modification date attributes. You've heard this story before, most of you, I think. In fact, I think that we do not have a robust account of identity and change in the digital world. And what the problem is, maybe I won't say, I'll just, it could be that we have idioms and they need to be made more precise. It could be with Wittgenstein, our idioms are just fine and we need to give up trying to make them more precise. Or we need to do something in a more ad hoc, opportunistic way. But in general, with documents being defined as graphs, files defined as byte streams, all these familiar tables described as relations. How do you add a record to a table? These, to me, for me, the reduction of familiar digital objects to their discrete mathematical, constructs is problematic because it doesn't seem to allow us to give an account of identity and change. And I would say that in this particular case, you know, it's not too hard to formulate a paradox where you say about a file that a particular file once was identical with this byte stream, and now it is identical with another byte stream. And that kind of claim is very difficult to manage in logic and ontology. Because it seems like byte streams have their bytes, essentially. That's why we call them byte streams. And this is a planet's preservation model. Fixity is a key feature of this model, and fixity is the bytes in a particular order.
Just in that refactoring further, why do you use stories instead of set of concepts, which apparently is what the original FRBR people meant by work? At least that's what it says in the FRBR documentation.
Again, repeat the question.
Alan had changed what was work as the top-level FRBR entity in his refactoring as nominalized roles. He changed work to story, and I was just interested whether that was.
Well, first, let me.
That was the term you really wanted there.
No, the term I really wanted there is stories, plural. So I made that slide today. So that should have been stories, plural. Namely, it's the that rectangle represents the set of all stories. Just like in the original FRBR diagram, the rectangle represented the set of all works. I know we talk about the work entity, but that's an unfortunate recent terminology that's been applied to conceptual modeling. The original term was entity type, and that rectangle is supposed to be a set. So my example refactored the top rectangle, stories, the set of all stories. Stories, the colloquial term. It's intended to be colloquial term, stories.
Alan, thank you for that talk. It was fabulous. It was compelling.
Fabulous.
It was fabulous. It was, it was provocative and also very well presented. I want to get back to Sid's crazy ideas about the Mona Lisa, because I thought that your presentation of knowing nothing at all about the Bibliographic stuff, your presentation of that dilemma was actually really interesting because I think it actually encompasses in miniature something we've actually been talking about all day, which I think is really, really important. It comes to also your last point, which is that the naive response to this would be, well, why are we inventing a proxy representing the Mona Lisa when our assertion is saying something about Sid, right? And if you follow that down, it's like, well, okay, so we represent the Mona Lisa with the proxy so that we can get out of this problem of merging Sid's assertions with ours, and then we follow this down so that we introduce a proxy for Leonardo because Sid is also saying something about Leonardo. And then by the time we're done, we have a whole map of the universe that represents Sid's world, Sid's own map, which corresponds to our map in some particulars, but in other very important particulars, it veers off in all kinds of bizarre directions, right? And so we actually have a problem where we're not we're trying to represent many possible worlds at once at that point, which only are articulated together at the points where they happen to correspond, or where we can make assertions about the relationships, like the Sid that believes in this other map happens to be an entity in this map, right? And which is, I think, comes directly to your final point, which is about that what we're modeling here isn't just items in the real world. It's crazy ideas that people have about items that may or may not be in the real world. And that sort of explodes into this, into this way, in this, epistemological minefield where we don't necessarily, we can't establish with any given authority at any given moment which of the possible worlds we're looking at is the world that we are actually believing in, because we turn the corner and they're a different way from a different direction. And you know, that's what Patty's data presents us with. That's why it's very ancient.
Sounds, yep. I'll just say that I don't think we have a good, robust way of representing indirect speech or the propositional correlate of indirect speech, period. You know, it's not a problem, not a recent problem, it's not a problem with modeling, it's that we don't understand from a logical point of view how to represent propositional attitudes in a way that makes computationally available the things that feel like they're computationally available.
There is actually, the V3C has very different ideas about that. So they say it's super simple. You basically have a triple on a triple. Basically you say Mona Lisa is attributed to Leonardo, and you have a second triple which says Martin Kemp says Mona Lisa is attributed to Leonardo.
Right.
And so you can do that for, so if you think about like all the assertions in your database which are about some object, for anyone you could have an infinite amount of triples basically asserting the assertion.
So
that's evil.
That's evil.
No, it's not evil. It's because if you look at Twitter, right, you have certain realities where there is that kind of thing where people say this is like that, this is like that, this is like that. So today the weather is fine. There will be on the order of number of people in the world assertion of how the weather is.
Right. So
and some people agree because they're in the same location.
Right.
But that's something we actually I think this kind of proxy thing, right, is somehow saying we are the guys who know that Mona Lisa is by Leonardo, which only is true for Mona Lisa and probably for 90% of all the objects in Europeana is actually not sure if it's by whom it is. And then there is this one opinion. And in fact, what they say themselves is an opinion too, which is a common sense out of nowhere.
So I think I know what Stefan's going to say.
I just wanted to say, maybe Stefan should add something.
Yeah. I first would like to thank you because it was fun. That's not fun, but just fun. But coming back to this Mona Lisa issue, this is extremely complex, and we've talked about it for ages now. First of all, Mona Lisa or La Gioconda is a very nice example of ideological use of language, because the difference between the two is enormous. In Italian, whenever we use La Gioconda, it's equal stolen. Now, the reality we have to face in Europeana is that we are not making statements in anything. We have statements from people that know, or pretend to know, and others that pretend to know, and we have to organize concurrent statements that we not agree on a given thing. And actually the mechanism we are waiting for now for years, and which is being discussed in the W3C, is the so-called name graphs, which then would enable you to model indirect speech a bit more elegantly, extending the triple model with the fourth element that would allow for provenance and versioning, these kind of things. Now, the problem is the name graphs have been talked about for 4 years now, they're not standardized. And the ORE proxy construct is something we would like to get rid of. We've borrowed that from the ORE model, and it is a somewhat idiosyncratic way of using that concept. But it was the only way we could tell the world, here is a set of assumptions about a given object that we have received, and that's where the figure you are quoting is incomplete. We make part of one aggregation. That aggregation was created by Europeana. Now the figure you're quoting misses the aggregation. And that makes the picture incomplete. The one thing we in Europeana do is create an aggregation. We are the creator of. And then this aggregation has several proxies, integrates them as statements about an object. We are not knowable, we are just inferable. But I totally agree with you that this is suboptimal, and I'm wondering still whether the name graphs will really solve
Here's my question to you. Yeah, so here's, and to be fair to your beyond, I mean, at this point, there's a nice little paragraph in the, I don't know which document, that in effect says, I know what you're going to say. But I just said, you know, but really, when you know, we thought about the alternatives at the time, and this was the best thing. But I ignore paragraphs like that because they interfere with my enjoyment of the modeling. But more broadly, the W3C has a kind of, to my mind, amusing history of trying to deal with radio obliqua. If you look back at the beginning days of reification, for instance, and especially the email lists where they discuss realizing what the consequences would be of RDF semantics for reification, which was designed to do this kind of thing. The problem is not a technical one. And this is what actually irritates me a bit about even the phrase name graphs. You know, name graphs is sort of an encoding of a representation, and the representation has a semantics. You know, many different ways we can encode that representation. There's nothing special, you know, about graphs. But the fact is, we don't know, I don't think we know how to do the semantics for what it is that we're representing. So it's not a question of having a data structure that we can manage, you know, that we can work with to, you know, program against. Although maybe this is a deep issue, because I guess what I'm saying is, for me, it's not an issue of having a data structure. It's an issue of understanding what the semantics is of what the data structure, of what that data, of the language, the data structure, semantics of the language, the data structure encodes. You know, W3C, RDF community has been working, you know, struggling on this for a while. You know, keywords would be Superman and Lois Lane, by the way. Just like keywords for adverbial modification is Sebastian slowly in Bologna.
We have two more, Chris and Thomas, and then we go to the
Alan, I wonder whether if you could go back to the previous slide, please, because that was your final suggestion for an answer at intentionality as the distinctive criterion, which we cannot really capture as long as we apply first for logic. So it is basically, if I understand you correctly, a suggestion to rather think in terms of a, let's say, constructivist versus an essentialist approach towards phenomena. I mean, we create the phenomenon because we construct a model of it, and it actually doesn't exist per se outside the model. Now, if I understood that correctly, perhaps not, is intentionality not actually too strong as a distinctive criteria? Because the test case which exemplified it to me, the best way where things begin to fall apart is this issue of identity over time. This question of when is it still it? Why does this problem occur? Because we're taking time into consideration all of a sudden, which we haven't done so far. So probably it's the question of identity, and something that has to do with identity rather than intentionality, because intentionality is a laden concept already. You know? It's very hard to ascribe intentionality to somebody who acts non-consciously. Does that agent have intentionality? But anybody of us here has a sense, or wants to have a sense of identity. And so my question is whether it's not rather identity, something that has to do with this change over time conundrum, that is the key criteria, rather than just intentionality.
Okay, but this slide is the kind of slide that one ends on and then everybody goes away. I meant to move this one up here right away. But I'm using intentionality really to just sort of indicate in a gross way, you know, human intellectual, cultural activity, and it includes subconscious activity, the way we understand language, the way we use language, the way we interact with each other, the conventions, the practices, just sort of gesturing towards that. Now, there are ways to make aspects of intentionality precise. You can, in modal logic, you can say this, intentionality consists of these features. If the prefix has these features, it's an intentional prefix. But I'm using it to just gesture towards those things, and I think of it as the thing, the distinguishing thing in humanities information data modeling, and the identity issues. I think they're hard. I don't know which ones are tied up with intentionality and which ones would be there anyway. But I do think it may even sound trivial to say this, that what's distinctive about humanities data modeling is humans, or rather agents that are capable of, thought and action in the ways that humans are capable of thought, action, and feeling. Because that's how we come to have culture, language, and action, in the human sense of action.
It's misleading that you talk about intentionality, but hidden below this you have social activity and things like, which point that actually you're not interested in the intentional activity, but in the outcome of cultural processes, which are normally not based on intentional activity. But you have you can describe it with an invisible hand model. And you have a third force determining what happens. Many people want something, nobody achieves it, and you have a result which is something there, like language, culture, practices, and so on. And that's very interesting, not in intentionality.
So maybe this may be the problem. So I'm using intentionality not in the sense of intention, not in the sense of doing something intentionally. I'm using it in the sense that goes back through Husserl and Brentano to medieval philosophy. It has to do with the mind, but not necessarily with intentional action. It doesn't mean conscious. It doesn't mean occurrent, thoughtful. It doesn't mean those. It's not like in law where you'd wonder whether or not it was intentional or whether it was instinctive. So it comes from the medieval terminology for a taxonomy of mental things, the things involved in thought. Yeah.
Just as a librarian, just coming back to FRBR, I think up to this day I was quite happy with FRBR. I don't want to say that you're a spoil sport now in terms of fun, but I think it was very elucidating and somehow unmasking the data modeling of librarians, so to speak. On the other hand, it made perfect sense to me. I think this notion of inheritance is difficult, you're right. On the other hand, for instance, a Neoplatonism could have made perfect sense, all of that, when the ghost from the work emanates into the hypothesis and creates an item or something. So there is an idea behind that makes sense, but not in terms of data modeling. So I think sort of mixing levels has taken place here. So it was in a way puzzling for me to see that the model works. It works perfectly well, and it meets a lot of problems we have in the library scene, like describing works, for instance, and to put it in relation with manifestations, what means imprints, to put it that way. It was puzzling in that it works and it's wrong to some extent. So what does this mean for data modeling?
Yeah, that's a good question. The side of that I would be most interested in sort of defending, because other people can defend the other side, is that it needs to be refined. I mean, there are a couple different attitudes towards it's wrong, but it works. It could One attitude is nothing is ever right. It either works or it doesn't. So forget about half of your concern is misplaced. Either it works or it doesn't. Forget about it being right or wrong. Another approach is, well, a lot of it's right and some of it's not quite right. And what I've done here and elsewhere is more or less along that latter line. We certainly know that we find it very useful.
Thanks a lot for this lively discussion, which I have to cut off at this point. And we have a 20 minutes, slightly shortened break of 20 minutes, and then we start again. Thanks.